I'm very pleased to introduce to you Professor David Eltis. As you recall, we postponed this some months ago. We're happy he's now able to be with us. He is Robert W. Woodruff Professor Emeritus of History at Emory University, and he has a PhD from the University of Rochester. His research interests are the early modern Atlantic world, slavery and migration, both coerced and free. He's the author of Economic Growth and the Ending of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which won the British Trevor Rees Memorial Prize, and The Rise of African Slavery in the Americas, published by Cambridge in 2000, which was awarded the Frederick Douglass Prize, the John Ben Snow Prize, and the Wesley Logan Prize. In 2008, Professor Eltis won the John T. Hubble Prize for the best article in the journal Civil War History. He's now here to talk about the transatlantic slave trade database found at www.slavevoyages.org, which he co-edited, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities funded collaborative project on the origins of Africans pulled into the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans. This project draws on the records of over 90,000 names and descriptions of Africans liberated from slavers in the first half of the 19th century. And I say liberated, quote unquote. The information was extracted from the registers of international courts that were established in 1808 to adjudicate vessels detained as they engaged in the transatlantic trafficking of Africans beyond 1807.
We're building this database and making it available. I'd like to just take a quick look at what we know now that we didn't know before in terms of the big picture. I think one fairly dramatic result that comes out from this research is the fact that because of the inter-American slave trade, we now know that more slaves arrived in Spanish America than the whole of the British Caribbean combined. And that's actually a major change from what we knew 20 years ago. It's disguised because if you just look at the transatlantic slave trade, of course the British Caribbean comes out ahead. But after you adjust for this new information we've got from the inter-American traffic, the picture changes. In fact, if you combine the traffic to Spanish America with the traffic to Brazil, you're basically accounting for 63% of the total slave trade. In other words, the slave trade wasn't primarily to the French, the British, and the Dutch Caribbean if you take into account the inter-American business. Of course, the British, the French, and the Dutch were responsible for those captives that ended up in Latin America, but it does change the overall picture somewhat. Secondly, there's a lot of emphasis on major ports like Nantes and Liverpool, Bordeaux, Bristol, but something that comes out of the new data we have is that pretty well everyone that could afford to make a transoceanic voyage, entered the slave trade. And the slave trade is not confined to just major ports. Basically, every port big enough to organize a voyage tried to break into the business. And we've got, because of the size of our data, we can now say that over 200 ports actually dispatched vessels to Africa. And many more, again, were involved in the inter-American traffic. This was a massive business, and more important, I think, when we're trying to figure out what happened and why, it was clearly completely and totally accepted by everyone. this was not seen as different from whaling or carrying wheat from the Baltic. It was simply another line of business. Thirdly, and this is also, in my view, quite a dramatic difference from what we used to think 25 years ago, we've got this very large participation of the Americas in the business. Everyone thinks of something called a triangular trade, which of course is anchored in Europe. And of course, it travels, vessels involved in it complete the triangle. They go from Europe to Africa and then to the Americas and back again. But in fact, while that trade is slightly bigger than the Americas trade, what people don't realize is that almost as many slave voyages were organized in the Americas as in Europe. Indeed, we've got no less, in the database, no less than 3,000 transatlantic slave voyages. I'm not talking of intra-American here. 3,000 transatlantic slave voyages setting out for Africa from the Caribbean alone. Of course, Cuba plays a big role in that in the 19th century, but there were slave trade businesses in Kingston, and especially in Barbados. Barbados was, I think, accounts for something like 7% of the total British slave trade. And those ships were not doing any triangles. They were going out and back from the Americas to Africa and back again. And that traffic was completely dominated really by Brazil. The Brazilian trade was based in Brazil. It's called Portuguese, and of course everybody on board spoke Portuguese, but they were essentially Brazilian ships that were going. And they account for close to half the total slave trade. It was massive. Now, we also, one of the side effects of this, miserable side effects of this, is that we know much more about the Middle Passage than we ever did before. We've combed almost, just about every logbook that has come to light. We've included in the database. We know more about the duration, the experiences of the captives, mortality, of course, and especially we can now track this over time and make observations that were not possible a quarter century ago. It's probably the case that we know more about slavery in Jamaica than for the trade to any other part of the Americas. The reason for that is because the British records are particularly good, and we're able to say with some confidence that we've got probably 95% of all the voyages that came into Jamaica in the database. If you put that together with the slave registration data, which was created for Jamaica 20 years before slavery was abolished, what we've got is this great, massive data, comprehensive data on who lived there and how they got there. And this is where the reparations issue comes in, one of the variables in the database is for slave prices. In other words, the price of the slave as the slave was taken off the vessel and sold on the island. And the price of any slave represents the present value of future expected earnings of the captive. So what we're saying here is that we pretty well know what was stolen from the enslaved people, because the value of their labor was represented in the price paid at the point of disembarkation. So in summary, we know 95% of the Africans that came on the island, and for the most part where they came from in Africa. And I'll show you the findings on that shortly. In addition, because of the intra-American slave trade, we know most about departures from the island and where they went. And we also know who most of the plantation owners were, but this is new data. We also have more complete information on the identity of the slave ship owners themselves. And this, I'm going to show you a table which summarizes this for the British slave trade. This shows the top 10, by top I mean those responsible for carrying the largest number of people across the Atlantic, the top 10 British slave traders. Past here stands for people of the Atlantic slave trade. And we're in the process of expanding the site to include biographical information on everybody who was associated with any specific voyage. And the captains and owners are obviously identified most frequently, but we're also identifying particular Africans who are on board too. Now, these families in the first column are all but one Liverpool-based. And Liverpool was easily the most important slave port by the end of the 18th century. The numbers are extraordinary. There's one family in Liverpool responsible for carrying 136,000 people across to the Americas. Even the 10th largest, this is the single Bristol-based family on the website, it still accounts for 41,000 people. And we can create similar tables, we will be able to very soon, on the basis of French owners, French ship owners, and a good number of the Portuguese owners too. So we're building data which I would say would be absolutely central to any reparations claim. You don't necessarily have to identify descendants of the families, although that's perfectly possible in this case. When I started this, or when I was in the middle of it about 20 years ago, I had a student come into my office to say that he'd heard from his family that they'd been associated with the slave trade. So I put his name in the database. And it turns out he was one of the Tarletons, number 4 on the list here. And he sort of staggered out the office to take this on board, even though the last of his ancestors involved in the traffic had probably died 2 centuries ago. Because this trade effectively ended in 1807. So, before I leave this slide, just notice that we're collecting information on family background. We're trying to, in effect, follow the money. We're trying to say where the family originated and what happened thereafter. One of the variables that isn't shown here is probate. In other words, we're finding out how much the family was worth at the death of the principal, one of the principals that shared that family name. So I think it's worth asking the question, how could this traffic start up and last for 350 years? And I think I've already given you part of the answer. It isn't not an explanation, but it's a clue. So I think a major clue is the fact that the traffic was totally accepted at the time. There's no particular reason for people to deny or cover up involvement in the slave trade. And that's the reason that this database is possible. It's the fact that we're not tracking through crimes that we would see as crimes, of course. We're tracking through business records, records of a business which was acceptable. In fact, the names of the ships are usually associated with family members of the owners. And in the Portuguese case, for 300 years, there was the names of saints. And the saints were invoked because they would protect the voyage and make it successful. That gives you some idea of the extent of acceptance. So you can often tell the name of the owner's wife and daughters simply by looking at the ship names that that family operated. So how? That's one part of it. Of course, you can't get far in an explanation without talking about sugar. And it's clear, and this is insufficiently stressed in most textbooks, I think, that forget about cotton, which of course dominates the history of slavery because of what happened in the US, but it didn't really come to the fore until the slave trade to the US had ended. The real reason for getting involved in the slave trade was to supply labor to sugar-producing areas. And in fact, 3/4 of the slave trade goes to those areas, starting with Brazil from the south and going up to, I guess, Louisiana in the north. You don't get sugar north of Louisiana. If you look at the new slide, you'll see the passage of sugar, which began in the Pacific, believe it or not. What I'm showing here is the migration of sugar cultivation over time. So what we've got is really a luxury item which is grown in India and by the Arabs and was learned by the Crusaders who invaded the Middle East in the 12th century. And the culture passes through the Mediterranean. And in each place, there's clearly slaves involved, although there's also free labor. And then, as you can see from the map, it passes through into the Atlantic Ocean, and goes to the what's called the Atlantic Mediterranean, which is the sea bordered by those islands, Canaries, Madeira, the Azores, before passing down the African coast to Sao Tome and the Gulf of Guinea, which at one point supplied over half of the sugar consumed in Europe in the 16th century. Then if you look at the other map in the inset, you can see that the process jumps to the Americas, first to Brazil, and then, of course, as everybody knows, to Barbados, and going from east to west, and then in an amazing completion of a circumglobal movement, it ends up in Hawaii in the 19th century, where it actually started probably sometime around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. In Hawaii, forced labor was also used. Although slavery was abolished, they had other forms of exacting labor from people. The second point, if we're explaining why it happened, is geography. And what we've got is something called a gyre, which basically organizes or dictates the movement of ocean currents in the major oceans. Gyres exist north and south of the equator in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, and you can see that the shape of the slave trade is very much dependent on these gyres. Basically, the slave ships from Europe followed the trade winds until the onset of the steamship, and we do have about 26 vessels in the database, which are steamships, believe it or not, operating around the mid-19th century. But the America's trade, which doesn't get anything like the attention of the North Atlantic, of course, uses the southern gyre and follows this route. So it's out to Africa, particularly Angola, and then moving back to Brazil. A few vessels, of course, crossed those gyres, crossed the equator, but none of this would have happened but for the existence of these gyres and the discovery of Europeans, which not only allowed them to get across the Atlantic, it also allowed them to take advantage of the Pacific, because the Pacific's organized in pretty well the same way. So now we come to the third reason why it happened. So we've got sugar, we need forced labor. Where's it going to come from? Well, I think we know where it came from, but it wasn't necessarily the foregone conclusion. I think we can perhaps move straight to the next slide, which shows you in 1500 the division between Islam and Christendom. These two world religions had raided each other for centuries. By 1500, they'd reached a sort of stalemate. They couldn't get supplies of slaves. And as you can see, Islam is pretty dominant. Inside the green line is the Islamic area as it stood in 1500. On the northern side, you have Christendom. And in effect, we've got this dramatic switch in the sourcing of slaves by both Islam and Christendom in the century after 1500. And both turned to Africa in order to draw the labor that they need. We don't have anything yet on the Indian Ocean slave trade, but there is a group in Amsterdam that's actually starting work on it. And eventually, probably when I'm long gone, we will add an Indian Ocean slave trade database to what we have here. So, what we've got then is a focus on Africa for labor, and then we find face-to-face the identity question. People ask, how come Africans enslaved other Africans? Nathan Huggins, 30 years ago, provided an answer which at first sight seems nonsensical, but if you think about it, it's absolutely right. They didn't know they were Africans. In other words, they had a conceptual identity which was significantly smaller than the subcontinent of sub-Saharan Africa. So what's happening on the African coast is that both Africans and Europeans are dealing with outsiders, people who they don't accept as part of their own society. And that's the principal explanation, in my mind, for the traffic being a slave trade rather than a slave raid. There was very little in the way of military expeditions into Africa, except for Angola. That's a different story. But the Europeans couldn't make any impression on Africa until the 19th century in terms of actual military domination. So, to emphasize this point, I just want to show you this graph, which is based on tracking references to slaves in Britain in the 17th and 18th century. It starts in 1641 and goes through to 1790. the question is, how did the British get involved in the slave trade? Well, I think this explains part of the answer. If you look at the newspapers and broadsheets, which I combed through several years ago, you'll find all sorts of references to slaves in the 17th and 18th century, but they are not black slaves. What they are is white slaves, and that's Europeans held in captivity in North Africa by Islamic peoples. So you go through, all the way through to the end of the 17th century, before there's a dawning recognition, well, actually, there are black slaves. I mean, of course they knew there were black slaves, but they didn't think it worth commenting on. They were just not part of white society, and therefore it was acceptable to enslave them. So this graph is very simple to understand. The white part at the top shows you the references to white slaves. The black part at the bottom shows you the trend in references to black slaves. So you get this dawning realization that, in fact, slaves weren't just white. In effect, to my mind, this shows a dawning realization of the humanity of the people that they were enslaving in Africa. And of course, what happens, the abolition movement kicks in about here, in the British case. So I think the slave trade and its ending are both explained in part by identity politics or identity conceptions of identity. So let's move on quickly to the results. We've got here a rare photograph of people just taken off a slave ship. This actually is a bit of a fraud too, because it dates from 1867, and the transatlantic slave trade probably ended in 1866. How would we have a photograph? Well, it's because this group of people were taken off a vessel in the Indian Ocean. And it shows you a lot of things. It shows you the condition that they're in. I know the logbook of the ship. They're actually on a naval vessel, and I know the logbook of that ship. And it turns out that these enslaved people had been on board just 3 days on the vessel. So their condition here is not the result of the voyage. It's the result of enslavement in Africa and the transportation to the coast. And it's immediately apparent. I mean, it's like looking at the concentration camp survivors. In this case, it's the result of dehydration, but it's not dehydration because there isn't enough water. It's dehydration because of dysentery. The evacuation of fluids from the body over several weeks has this impact. And it's these people in this condition who are dying on slave ships. It's the only photograph that we have. It's the earliest photograph we have of slaves on a ship. Now, we don't have photographs for the 18th century, but we do have some very good contemporary images. And this is one. It's authentic. We know it's done at the time. It's a painting. And this is the Marie Seraphique from Nantes. And it's just traded at Loango. And this is taken, it was actually painted by one of the officers of the slave ship. And we know that the owner of the slave ship was very proud of it. He took the picture and hung it in his office. And it survived today. You can see it in Nantes. Going back to what I said about the acceptability of the slave trade, I think it's another indication. And here is what the ship looked like on the inside. This also is a contemporary painting. It's done by one of the officers. The ship's in the Atlantic. It's sailing across, and the guy goes down with his paints and easel and he draws this picture and paints it. You can see the conditions. This should be used everywhere instead of the Brooks image. The Brooks image, which people know, of the Liverpool slave ship in the late 1780s, is not authentic. This one is authentic. Here's another image from the 19th century, and this is from the illegal period. By this stage, they even abandoned slave decks. The captives are really sitting on barrels. We know that many of the captives have been removed already at this stage of the painting because the naval ship that had captured their vessel had taken them on board to reduce the crowding. And this also is a 19th century depiction, an accurate one, taken at the time, of a vessel captured by the British in 1838. And this one is actually hanging in the the African American Museum in Washington. The interesting thing is that what you see, we know about this ship too, what you see is about half the people on board. What you can't see, unless you look very closely, is beneath decks. The other half of the cargo, if you want to call it that, are actually below deck, and two of the openings to the cargo are open. One here, you can't see it with this projection, and one here, and you can see the people down there. So basically you have to double what you see to appreciate the numbers on board and the crowding that was the result of that situation. Okay, so
we close in just before the ship arrives on the African coast to get a clear view of the conditions that approximately 600 captives had to endure on their 2-month middle passage to the Caribbean. The Aurore was a typical 18th century slave ship. The main deck shows two key features designed to control the male slaves. First, the barricado, a 9-foot high wooden wall that divided the ship in two. This was topped with spikes and swivel guns. Second, 2 iron chains can be seen running along the upper deck. Every morning, the crew brought the shackled male captives up onto the deck from the spaces they had slept in overnight. The crew locked the main shackles into the chain to restrict movement. African men were not only chained in place, but continually within the firing line of the swivel guns. African women and children were imprisoned behind the barricado, normally unshackled, where they could neither see the men nor speak to them. Fearful that the male captives might escape their chains and try to capture the ship, the majority of the crew also remained behind the barricado. We descend from the quarterdeck to the officers' quarters and galley. A cook prepared the slaves' food in this boiler. The captives' diet consisted mainly of a starch such as rice, beans, or flour. Enslaved people were forced to eat this monotonous diet twice a day. They drank just 2 pints of water daily, leading to constant and often deadly dehydration. As the sun began to set, the crew, armed with whips and guns, forced the slaves below deck. The space below was divided by wooden walls to keep the men and women separated. The men were released from the deck chains and forced below, still shackled in pairs. Some were forced to lie on top of the platforms around the side of the room. Others lay under the platforms. Each captive, on or under a platform, slept in a space just 14 to 18 inches wide and 30 inches high. Most were forced onto their sides and pressed against their neighbors. Others sat in their meager intervening spaces. The Aurore's prisoners spent at least 14 hours in such cramped, dirty, and stifling conditions which they endured daily for 2 or 3 months before reaching the Caribbean. We have no contemporary depictions of the Aurora's 600 captives as the vessel left Malimba to cross the Atlantic Ocean. We do, however, have an image of a crammed lower slave deck painted on a voyage of a smaller slaver, the Marie Séraphique, from just a few years earlier. This comes into view in an overlay as the camera zooms out. The overlay shows only 340 captives, while the Aurore carried almost twice this number.
This shows the origins of people arriving in Jamaica, but it does so in terms of the modern countries of Africa. So, as far as I know, it's the first time this has been done. It breaks down based on the 7,000 voyages that we've got arriving in Jamaica, the origins. And it's color-coded, so you can see the heaviest numbers are from Angola, Benin, Nigeria, and Ghana. And then you have fewer numbers from the regions interspersed and on either side. Basically, the slave trade draws on, as you might expect, the more heavily populated areas of Africa, and that is defined in terms of rainfall. So you can see that it's really from here to here that most captives are drawn, because that's where the population densities were greatest. We can actually reproduce this for any island in the Caribbean and any country in Europe, any country in the Americas, actually. It's unusual to express this data, or these data, in terms of modern countries. But it's actually something that makes it more comprehensible to most people. If you look at the original maps, you'll see it's all in terms of historical regions or geographic regions, which I think for many people doesn't mean too much.
One of the things, very impressive work. One of the things we had heard, or certainly I was disabused of some time ago, was the feeling that all who came to Jamaica were enslaved. If I look at the period 1857, it says the slave trade probably had stopped some 50 years before that.
That's right.
Does that account for the Angolans and the people from the Democratic Republic of the Congo?
No, that goes back to the 18th century. There were a few voyages after 1807, actually after 1808, but these were all vessels that were captured by the British and taken into Kingston. For a short time, Kingston had a court, a mixed commission court, where these vessels were adjudicated. And the people on board the vessel were set free, is probably not the right way to say it, because they'd be under some sort of apprenticeship, but at least it wasn't slavery by the time slavery had been abolished. And there's some expectation that some of them would have actually experienced freedom in its original sense eventually. But that's the origin of those people that arrive after 1808. They're all coming on ships captured by the British. Actually, 2 of them were shipwrecks. They were on their way to Cuba, and they wrecked off the Jamaican coast.
My question is really a follow-on from the previous one, because we've often been told that the Congolese came as indentured, or that the vast majority came to St. Thomas, and because there's a large proportion of Congolese there, and Kumina, and these traditions have come up from there. But what you're saying now is essentially that most of them came in the early part of the 19th century via slave ships, basically.
18th century, really. It's after, you can see very clearly the breakdowns in the database, but after 1750 and before 1807, I think that period would account for just about everybody from that region, to be honest. I'm not aware of indentured servitude, people under indentured servitude coming after the abolition of the slave trade.
Well, not indentured servitude, but actually what we call... Yeah, they...
Oh, yes, there are a few, that's true. But compared to Trinidad and Guyana, there weren't that many. You're looking at perhaps, I don't know, maybe 1,000 or 2,000. I could find out, but it's not a huge number. But that's true. I've forgotten about that. That's after 1808, for sure. Yeah.
And the last one was this notion of Africans not identifying as Africans. You were trying to explain how Africans could trade with Africans.
Right.
If you could expand on that.
Right. Well, I often think of it counterfactual, which some historians in the room will start blenching at, I guess. But there was a kingdom of Mali in the Middle Ages in Africa, which was the source of most of the gold that entered Europe. That was, the gold, of course, was extracted by slaves. And if that trade had been a little bigger, it would have been perfectly reasonable to expect a reverse slave trade developing across the Sahara from the north to the south, in which case they would have drawn on the traffic that was currently at that time in the Middle Ages operating throughout the Mediterranean. And I think of how those slaves would have been described, and they would have been described as Slavs, probably. They would have come from the same range, wide range of ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups. There's no one in Europe which, in fact, if you want my honest view, I don't think there's anyone in the world who cannot claim descent from a slave, because slavery has been an institution which goes back to written records and even before. So I think if that had happened, the word white would have become what the word black became, and it would be the ethno-linguistic variety would disappear. People would just see them as slaves. And that's essentially what happens on the African side when the transatlantic traffic begins. It's, I think that creolization is actually pretty dominant very early. I think a lot of I'm thinking in particular of the influence of the Yoruba in Cuba. They have this enormous presence, and actually in the US. And yet, if you look at the figures, there's far more Igbo than Yoruba traveling across the Atlantic. But the Igbo somehow merge. The Yoruba maintain a separate identity. How do you explain that? It's nothing I can do with economics or statistics to explain why that happens. It's just that some ethno-linguistic cultures apparently not only remain but attract other people to join them, even though their origins may not be Congo. To go back to the previous question.
Fascinated with the names of ships, the name of the daughters, owners of ships. And,
yeah.
Can't find the name of the Africans. Anywhere in the data?
We've got the names of the Africans. This is a record of the people who had disembarked from captured slave vessels after 1807. And we actually have 92,000 of these, and they're all in the database. And you can search by name, you can search by all these variables across on the left here, and most important of all, we're in the process of developing a new interface on this website which will allow you to see the modern interpretation of these names. So in the second column, you can see the name as it was written down, and what we've done since 2010 through a website called African Origins, is to ask people to identify those names. And we're able to associate an ethno-linguistic identity with the names for about 30,000 of the 92,000. So that's it? That's your question?
Just wanted to hear one or two of the names. Just want to hear the sound.
You can, yeah, we're in transition. We've got here, I mean, up to recently, you could actually click on this, and it would take you to the African Origin site, which is not behaving itself because it's in transition. But anyway, it lists the names and provides a pronunciation. And the pronunciation, there's really two databases here. One's established in Sierra Leone, and that's recorded by English-speaking people, and the other in Havana by Cubans. And what we did was got English-speaking people, because the clerks who were writing it down in Sierra Leone were English, to pronounce the names. And the same in Cuba, we got Spanish speakers or Cuban accented speakers to pronounce the names there. And people, users can identify the name and tell us what they think it is. And then we make a decision about ethno-linguistic identity. But that's going to take the better part of this year to get up and operating.
I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on the inter-American trade that you mentioned. So, for example, in the case of Jamaica, does the data give you a sense of who is being traded into the Spanish America, and if there are differences in prices between what enslavers are paying here and what enslavers are paying in Cartagena de Indias or whatever the case might be?
Well, certainly the Spanish, people that take the Spanish Empire as being equivalent to fraud and smuggling. But in point of fact, there was a substantial difference in price between Cuba and Jamaica, even though they're close together. And that tells you that the smuggling wasn't that big, because if it had been that big, there wouldn't have been a price difference. I think we have to take the political divisions of the trade a bit more seriously than we have in the past. Colin Palmer, for example, and several people argue that, well, there was so much smuggling going on that it was the same. So to go back to the first part of your question, what we did was take the African origins of the traffic going into the Dutch Caribbean, the British Caribbean, and the French Caribbean, and then apply those ratios to the departures from Jamaica to the Spanish Americas. That's how we got at the African origins of those individuals. And that's not too difficult to do.
So I wonder if there was a sense, if you have a sense that they prefer to, for lack of a better word, export a particular type of.
Well, one thing that's just come out, actually, it's a piece of information that's 2 weeks old, because it just hit me, is that if you look at the sex ratios on the inter-American traffic from the British Caribbean to the Spanish Caribbean, it's a very high male ratio. It's like 84% male. And that, I think, is the main reason why the traffic to Spanish America hasn't been properly explored, because if you have 84% of the influx being male, you're not going to have too much in the way of descendants. So the African descent population in Latin America, and I'm generalizing, of course, it's quite minor. It's just not the same size as, say, Jamaica or anywhere else in the Caribbean. And I think that's an explanation which nobody's picked up. In fact, I think it's worth a paper. I'm going to think about it.